I'm Johnny Lewis. Thank you for viewing my case study related to copyright and computer technology. The case summary is that St. Regis is a rural K-8 school with limited resources that come from state funding and two major fundraisers a year. And you are Mr. Sample, who's a third-year principal from out of town and has a high percentage of support from the faculty. A detailed plan was made and followed to raise support for computer labs and software as requested by the faculty, and Mrs. Lynn, a media specialist, began making illegal copies of the new software after it had been purchased from the lab, as several teachers had requested that they wanted to use it both in their classroom and in the computer lab. She viewed this as a way to save money for the school. The case summary is that Mrs. Brandon, a new teacher, has approached you about this violation of copyright and expressed her discomfort in participating in it. When Mr. Sample approached Mrs. Lynn, she admitted to the practice and she offered to go to the PTA to tell them that she was saving money for the school. She argues that no one will find out about the copyright violation because it's a rural school district far away, and Mr. Sample must decide how to respond to this situation. Here are the potential legal and ethical issues related to the case study. Number one, we don't learn the district policy, but depending on the district policy, if it's like my school district's policy, Mrs. Lynn may have implicated herself and others in participating in breaking a contractual employment agreement. While it is possible that no one will find out about the illegal copies, as we'll see at the end of this presentation, it is becoming more prevalent that schools, even rural schools, are caught when breaking copyright law, and it could be very expensive for the school district, far more expensive than paying for the software. As copies are being used for their intended purpose, they're not extensions of what the software was created for or creative expressions, they do likely violate copyright law. Mr. Sample, as a principal, is responsible for modeling ethical behavior to his staff, and the entire staff is responsible for modeling ethical behavior to students. Knowingly participating in illegal behavior and the devaluing of the work of others sends the wrong message to all parties involved. And unlike the team process that was used to purchase the lab and the software, Mrs. Lynn has taken control of this situation on her own. She's not collaborated or partnered with stakeholders, and she seemed uninterested in other perspectives. As a leader, this should raise red flags to us. Here's the synthesis of the issue. Mr. Sample's role as an ethical leader of the school is at a crossroads in this moment in which the school's limited resources and what appears to be some staff's popular opinion, it's pitted directly against what he knows to be his moral and ethical and legal responsibility as the caretaker of the school and the school's culture. Here are the people that are involved in this story. Mrs. Lynn and a number of staff who appear to support the copying. The PTA, Mrs. Lynn offers to talk with them, and she suggests that she has a relationship with them that probably extends past Mr. Sample's tenure. Mrs. Brandon and any other school staff who are uncomfortable with the copying. The students who are going to be exposed to this behavior. The student, staff, district stakeholders who are at risk of financial penalties if they're caught. The donors and organizers who worked hard to raise money for this software for it to be used legally. Mr. Sample and his reputation with the staff, district leaders, the community, students, and stakeholders all will be affected by this decision. The place. St. Regis as a school is a small rural school with limiting funding and a small student population. St. Regis as a community is a small rural town where people are connected to one another and lived in the same small town for a long time. And I think an important place is Other Place in this case study because Mr. Sample and Mrs. Brandon are both from other places. They're from outside that interconnected world of St. Regis relationships. The programs in this case study, the Technology, Software, and Media Center for St. Regis School, the K-8 school, and the recently fundraised computer labs and software that are selected by teachers throughout the school. Section 5, reviewing and prioritizing the information. Could the conflict, the situation, or the decision be damaging to stakeholders or to the community? I think that's pretty obvious. The situation could be damaging to the district in several ways. If the school were caught copying materials illegally, there are example cases that we'll see throughout the presentation that could suggest that the district could wind up paying a lot of money, financial penalties for legal expenses, in addition to any money that they would owe the company for buying the proper materials. Additionally, students are being exposed to illegal behavior by their school district and they could suffer in their ethical development. What individuals have an important stake in the income? Mr. Sample, Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Brandon, the PTA, the school district students, all participating staff, and anyone who participated in the previous fundraisers. Have the relevant stakeholders been consulted? No, I think at this point, that's one of the red flags here, is that Mrs. Lynn has chosen to engage in this behavior on her own. Mr. Sample found out about it without her knowledge, and now she's ignoring his advice. Can we learn more about the situation? It would be helpful to know what teachers beyond Mrs. Lynn have been involved in this situation, how long it's been happening, how big it is. It would also be helpful to have copies of district copyright policies, assuming that they exist. Do we know enough to make decision? I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is, despite any other mitigating circumstances, illegal activities are being engaged in by the school staff, and this requires action by leaders. So here are the options for response, section 6. Option 1, Mr. Sample could do nothing. The supporting arguments for that are that teacher support for him is high. Many teachers appear to support copying the software. It saves money, and it does support learning. Mrs. Lynn is probably right. No one will probably find out. And he can say that he asked her to stop if anyone questions him about it. Here are the potential consequences of doing nothing. Mr. Sample's putting himself, Mrs. Lynn, and the district at risk of litigation and financial penalties that could actually be more expensive. He's violating the standards of his position as a building leader by acting unethically and condoning illegal behavior. He risks losing the respect as a building leader of Mrs. Brandon and other potential staff who share her concerns. A second option for Mr. Sample would be to insist on the copying stopping, but then give teachers an option to install software either in the library or in the classroom. The potential supporting arguments for that is that the potential for losing money by penalty goes away, the illegal activity stops, and teacher choice is consistent with ethical management practices. It honors the building leader's commitment to staff autonomy, and it listens to the staff who suggested that student learning was affected by their lack of access to the software. Here are the potential consequences of this choice. It doesn't really address the issue of Mrs. Lynn's relationship with the PTA and supporting the teachers who wanted the software to be in both places. The issue of student learning that created this situation, the need for them to be in both places, is still unaddressed. And without communicating a why and creating a long-term policy, Mr. Sample risks facing this issue again or feeling like it's never really been taken care of. Option 3 for Mr. Sample would be that he could stop the copying, communicate with the staff about the issue, and begin fundraising for legal purchases of additional copies. These are the supporting arguments. Communicating with the staff about appropriate copyright behavior would set the standard for the future. Fundraising has a history of working for this school and involves key stakeholders in the solution. Long term, this addresses the key issue that's creating the tension, the need for additional software to enhance student learning. Here are the potential consequences. Mrs. Lynn and other teachers who wanted the additional software could feel targeted unless Mr. Sample is very careful here. Teachers who wanted classroom copies will feel frustrated at the delay that the fundraising process could take. It took 3 years to raise the money the last time. It could potentially push the copying activities then because they feel the need to have it to continue, only secretly and perhaps even more difficult to discover. And Mrs. Lynn could use her familiarity with the PTA to create waves for Mr. Sample because he's not really addressing the needs immediately that have been presented. So evaluating these options, option 1 has the greatest risk factor. There are legal issues, financial losses, student and team ethics. I don't really think ignoring illegal behavior is truly an option. Option 2 seems like a good start, but it doesn't go far enough. How do we keep this from happening again? Option 3 seems like a good long-term plan, but it doesn't do enough immediately to ensure that Mr. Sample will have the time to get to carry it out. And so I believe for Section 8, the best option is to combine option 2 and option 3, combining elements of option 2 and 3. Mr. Sample needs a short-term plan to stop the copying and to address the immediate needs for teachers, as well as a long-term plan that ethically addresses the issue, that involves others, and seeks to prevent these issues from happening in the future. Can this decision be implemented with the greatest care and attention to the concern of all stakeholders, and have they been consulted? Combining these two plans involves and considers the most stakeholders. It considers the staff, the students, the teachers on both sides of the issue, and the community who participated before and will participate again in the fundraising. All of them will be engaged and be part of this plan. Not everybody will be thrilled with the choice, but it provides an opportunity to listen to everyone and to address all of the issues the best that you can. This seems like an ethical and holistic team response. Have we identified creative options? I think combining kind of our middle and our long-term option is a creative way of dealing with the issue. And so this is how I would suggest implementing it. Part one, a short-term response. I would investigate and prepare a description of the potential financial risks of copyright infringement. I would review the district's copyright policy, if there is one. It should cover this issue if it exists. I would share all of this information with Mrs. Lynn privately and insist that the copying of the software stop immediately and that copies that were made before be destroyed in order to avoid putting the school at risk. I would try to do so in a tone that expresses appreciation for her concern and gratitude for her attempt to respond to a learning need. I'd present the information to the staff and the PTA and explain the dilemma that there's this need for software and for protecting staff members from legal ramifications. I would allow teachers in the short term to allow whether to have legally purchased copies of software installed in the media center or in their classrooms. Here are the justifications for this response. A school district in Houston, Texas was forced to pay $9.2 million for copyright infringement. That district argued for fair use of test prep materials, but the court rules against them. School resources are at risk. The use of the copy material doesn't meet the standard for fair use. The copy material is being used for its specific purpose, and so paying the price for the material, and it's done for the purpose of avoiding paying the price for the material actually for what it's intended to. That violates copyright law and regulation. Ethical leaders have to consider all consequences of their choices related to school-level governments. Giving teachers choice on where to install the software in the short term is consistent with ethical management practices, and it models ethical behavior. It avoids illegality, and it honors a building leader's commitment to staff autonomy. Ethical leaders communicate the purpose and methodology of actions to the staff and stakeholders, and they invite their full participation and feedback. All of these steps do that. The best practices for school copyright policy include specific definitions of appropriate copyright use of technology. So hopefully the board's policy has that, but if not, that's something that needs to be addressed. If the district policy is similar to my own, it essentially states that the district isn't going to represent or advocate for staff members who are accused of copyright violation. So this proposed response encourages the well-being, it's essentially being an ally to the staff. Ethical use of copyrighted material isn't just limited to legal and financial ramifications. It promotes future success for students as they learn to value the work of others. It prepares them for collegiate concerns related to plagiarism. And then under implementation, a long-term response. I would invite a team of staff to research, develop, and revise a copyright policy that specifically states the district's copyright policy so teachers and staff know how to determine acceptable use. I'd invite Ms. Lynn to be part of that team if it feels appropriate. I'd engage the PTA and other leaders to develop a fundraising strategy similar to the one that was used to purchase the computers and software that we've already gotten. I develop and carry out an annual training that clearly conveys a revised copyright policy and identifies appropriate use of copyright materials, the risk of not doing so, and the district response to violations. The justifications for these are that ethical leaders use operating systems which develop teams to make decisions and problem solves and assess needs and consider consequences. Mrs. Lynn meant well, but an issue with her solution is she didn't follow an ethical model by involving other people. Mr. Sample can overcome some of the potential fallout with staff and parents and stakeholders by making them aware of the legal and ethical issues and focus on student and staff well-being. Best practices for building leaders include operating systems that ensure copyright policies are in place which follow the law and regulations that have been communicated and understood by and approved by stakeholders, and that have trained the staff and the district policy. It encourages staff awareness and well-being related to copyright infringement, and it asks for signed confirmation that they have received and understood board policy. What if this doesn't work? There is the potential for Mrs. Lynn to respond negatively. At some point as administrator, it's still your responsibility to ensure that the staff are behaving ethically and legally. District HR would have to be involved at some point if Mrs. Lynn does not stop the copying behavior after receiving the information. Relationship with other staff who participated with Mrs. Lynn, they may not take this response well. Care should be taken to present this action as a means of being an ally to the staff. And there is potential that fundraising efforts fail or that the appetite for fundraising may be low. If this is the case, additional grant funding, funding from local businesses, or benefactors could be sought. These are the resources I used in creating my presentation.